The strongest warriors are the ones who will sacrifice anything to help the world, even themselves. You are such a genuine gem. Thank you for clicking on my Foul Play February series. I'm Brooke Makenna, but today's video is going to be the story of Nellie Bly. Hers was unlike anything of its time because she was so determined to find the truth and save these people from the rumored torture that they were enduring. But first, she had to become them. By the way, I am posting every single day this month, and I have not missed a day yet so far, so there will be a playlist link down below if you've missed any, and make sure to thumbs up if you are enjoying this month, just so I know, and it just makes me super happy to see that, along with responding to comments down below. Now let's get into the story. So a girl named Elizabeth Cochran Seaman was born May 5th of 1984 in Cochran's Mills, Pennsylvania. Her father Michael had bought a mill and the land surrounding their family farmhouse. He was a merchant, a postmaster, and an associate justice, which is why they named this place after him. His first marriage was to a woman named Catherine, whom he had 10 children with, but they divorced and he married again to a woman named Mary Jane, who he had 5 more children with, one being Elizabeth. Growing up, Elizabeth actually had the nickname of Pinky because she loved the color so incredibly much that that was all that she would wear. But as she grew into a teenager, she decided that Pinky wasn't sophisticated. The color wasn't something she enjoyed anymore, so she went back to going by Elizabeth and changed her surname to Cochran instead of Seaman. She went to boarding school for quite a while until her father actually passed away, and due to their insignificant funds, they had to move to Pittsburgh and go to regular school. Around this time, when they went to Pittsburgh, they were introduced to the Pittsburgh Dispatch, which was a newspaper in the area, and it was about the 1880s, and Elizabeth was about 16 at the time. And she came across this article in the newspaper called "What Girls Are Good For." And this was just saying that basically women were just there to keep the house clean and also birthing children, but that was the only 2 things that they were good for. And reading this, Elizabeth got so incredibly angered that she decided to write into the newspaper under the pseudonym Lonely Orphan Girl. She didn't think much of it. She said what she wanted to say and she left it at that. But a few days later, she noticed in the newspaper, the editor of the entire newspaper was asking in an article for the Lonely Orphan Girl to come forward and say who she really was. He was so incredibly impressed by her passion in her writing. Upon meeting this editor, he decided to ask her to write another article called The Girl Puzzle, and it was to be about how divorce affects women and to change the reform in divorce laws. And after she wrote that, he was blown away to the point where he offered her a full-time job at the newspaper at only 16. But the thing was, back then, women needed to change their name as writers so that anybody would read it. And so the editor decided to call her Nellie Bly. It was the song title of a man named Stephen Foster, and so that's what she went by, Nellie Bly. It didn't seem like she really minded at this time. She was getting to write about things she really enjoyed. In fact, she began investigating into the working environments of women, factory workers, just investigating what they were going through, what it was like for a working woman. And that is when the complaints began filing in from the owners of all of these places where these women were working. And due to that, her investigative journalism halted because she was sent to do work on the women's pages of the newspaper, doing things like high society, fashion, gardening, all things she absolutely despised, and that is not what she wanted to be talking about. She was about 21 at this time, and she decided she wanted to go to Mexico to be a foreign correspondent there. And after being there a little while, she decided that is what she wanted to do. So she went home, she packed her stuff, and she headed back to Mexico for 6 months to do some investigative journalism. And while she was there, she found that a local journalist was actually imprisoned for criticizing the Mexican government. Upon hearing of these reports and the things that Nellie was saying about the Mexican government, they threatened to arrest her, and so she fled back to the United States, but that didn't mean she was afraid. She actually continued talking about it, and she wrote reports saying that the Mexican government was suppressing the people and that they were controlling the press. But as much as that invigorated her, she went back to the Pittsburgh Dispatch and was reporting on the same minuscule things as she was before, the women's fashion and gardening, and nothing like she really wanted. But eventually she got tired of doing that, and in 1887 she quit that job and decided to head for New York City. She spent 4 months trying to find a job there when finally she talked her way into Joseph Pulitzer's office. And after an interview, he offered her a job with the New York World newspaper. And with that, she was offered an assignment, which was basically one of the most impossible, courageous feats in investigative journalism so far. And most weren't even sure it was possible, because she was about to fake insanity. And it was all to find if the reports of the brutality, the negligence of the women's lunatic asylum on Blackwell's Island were true. Nellie's colleagues were worried she would never pass all of the tests that proved she was insane to get her sent there, but she thought of herself as quite the actress, and she believed she could do it. She was even told by one of them that she had a too infectious smile and no one would believe that she was actually crazy. So she said she would smile no more. The only real question she had to the editor was, how would they get her out when she was done with all of this? How would they make sure she wouldn't be stuck there forever? And they assured her that they could get her out at any time and tell exactly why she was there and who she was as soon as she was done with her reports. She would go by Nellie Brown, another pseudonym, and she then had to decide how she was going to get committed, what would be the most likely scenario that would make people believe her. It was either go to a psychiatrist and tell them that she was insane and have them commit her, or it was have other people send her to the police courts and worry that she actually was. So she decided to dress in ragged clothing and head to a temporary home, a woman's shelter, and stay there for the night. She checked in, she stayed awake all night. She kept her eyes wide open at all times to make herself look even crazier. She'd practiced all of this in the mirror before she went to make herself look the most insane. It was to the point where her roommate that was supposed to sleep with her that night refused to do so. She began making accusations about the other boarders there, saying, "There are so many crazy people about and no one can ever tell what they will do." And after a few nights of refusing to go to bed and scaring the other boarders, that she was taken to the courthouse, and a judge, a doctor, and an officer all examined her to see if she was really crazy. Now, at this point, she was saying that she didn't remember who she was, where she was. She didn't even say that she was in New York City. She said, every time they said, "Why are you in New York City?" she would say, "I'm not." And she put on this fake accent, and she just really was telling them she didn't know anything, but all she wanted was her luggage that she never brought with her because she didn't want anyone to know who she was. Now, unfortunately, in this time, women could be committed to asylums for anything. They showed a slight bit of PMS. They showed any sort of mood swings, and they'd automatically be sent there just because they were a woman, basically. And so she kind of assumed that it would be easy to just get sent straight to Blackwell Island. But unfortunately for her, the judge remarkably decided to be nice to her, and he said that she actually looked like his dead sister. And so instead of sending her to an asylum, he was going to send her to the Bellevue Hospital for evaluation. When she was there, all they did was accuse her of being on drugs or being a prostitute, and after a few weeks of being there, she noticed the malnourishment, the lack of food she was getting, the lack of blankets she was getting, the physical abuse, and the lack of caring that these staff members had for the patients. I mean, she wasn't even yet at the asylum where there was supposed to be this abuse happening, and it was already happening to her. She would complain about this, and the staff members would only say, "People on charity should not expect anything and should not complain." By then, she was already thought to be insane and was headed to a place for people like her. And this wasn't yet Blackwell's Island, but it was a step closer to it. Because you see, Blackwell's Island was basically the worst of the worst. If you were sent there, you were never leaving. Inside this asylum was all white walls, 2 huge iron doors, padlocked, with a whole bunch of rooms down this hallway. There were 3 patients there by the time that Nellie got there. She was the 4th, and one of them being Anne Neville, who was a young chambermaid who had run into some health issues, and because she couldn't work was sent to one of these homes, these women's shelters. She was sent to the Bellevue Hospital, the same one Nellie had gone to, where they eventually transferred her there. After talking to this young chambermaid, Nellie realized that she wasn't insane at all, and she knew it. And she just said that nobody would listen to her anyway, so she didn't care to talk about it. Nellie also found another one of the patients who was in need of medical attention, but she wasn't necessarily insane either. She was more like just a little silly. Miss Fox was the 3rd, and she told Nellie that her case was hopeless before refusing to talk any further. After finding these other patients, Nellie decided to drop the whole act. She didn't need to act crazy to be there because these women who were already there weren't crazy at all, and yet they were still there. So she completely dropped the act, and she decided to see if acting completely sane would change anything. And in fact it did, because the more sane she acted, the more crazy they believed she was. And for dinner that night, they got a cold plate of food, and later that night, they got cold bodies. You see, all the windows in the halls were open, and it was almost unbearable to be in there. It was so incredibly cold. All of the nurses were completely bundled up, but they didn't give the patients anything. And if they asked for something like Nellie did, she would just be handed a shawl that had moths inside, had holes all over, and didn't keep her warm whatsoever. She decided she was just going to go to bed to possibly get warm that way, but the nurses told her she couldn't, and took her to a doctor for more examinations to make sure she was insane to go to the next step of the asylum. This was basically just a stepping stone. So they took her to this doctor, and again, she wasn't acting anymore. But he decided that she was positively demented and told her she wasn't going anywhere. That next day, she was taken to a higher up asylum where she decided that night she was actually going to sleep. But she couldn't, because again it was far too cold, and there was constant footsteps of all of the staff walking back and forth, making it impossible to sleep. The next morning they were awoken at 6 a.m. on September 25th to wash their faces and get their nails cut. After that, they would have another examination where they were asked if they saw faces or heard voices. Nellie said yes, she did, and he said, I thought so. After that, they would have meals that either consisted of hard bread and prunes that were almost impossible to swallow, or spoiled beef that they had to eat with their hands. And then it was time to be transferred to Blackwell Island Lunatic Asylum, where most never came out of. It was huge stone buildings that absolutely reeked so badly Nellie had to hold her breath. She began asking the other patients if they knew where they were, and they said yes, but to be quiet, because they would never believe that they were going to try to escape. These patients thought that they were going to hatch a plan of getting out of there, and so she needed to be quiet to not let anyone else know. They didn't realize it would be much harder to escape than they thought. They then met the other patients that were already inside. One of the patients was even begging to do more tests on her to prove she wasn't insane, but all of the doctors absolutely refused. It was just as cold inside this asylum. The food was just as bad, but even worse were the cold baths. They were taken to a cold, wet bathroom and told to undress. If they refused like Nellie did, the nurses would begin to undress them themselves. They would use the same bathwater for every single person and the same towel. They would force them into the bathtub, and even if they protested, they would tell them to shut up. They then put ice cold water over them and would scrub them down with a tin filled with soap. And then they would pour buckets upon buckets of cold water over their heads. They would gasp and almost like they were drowning, but these nurses didn't care. She was then dressed in a flannel with the label Lunatic Asylum BIH6. But that night in her room, the anxiety arose in her even more, and it wasn't because of what she had gotten herself into, but the sudden realization that every single patient in that asylum would die if there was a fire. You see, every single door was locked individually, the windows were heavily barred, and no one would come for them and risk burning themselves up in a fire by unlocking every single door to let crazy people out. She would die in there if anything happened. The longer she stayed there, the worse the torture got, and she even would witness something called a rope gang, which was supposedly where the worst patients on the island would come and see them, and they would all be tied together by wide leather buckles, basically, and they would all stand in a line tied together and be tortured by the nurses, and everyone from Nellie's section of the island would have to sit on benches for hours and hours, unable to move, to talk, to eat, to go to the bathroom, anything, just to watch what these nurses were doing to them. Nellie had seen nurses choking and beating patients, as well as drugging them with morphine to get them to go to sleep. There was one patient named Urena who went in claiming she was 18 years old, and when the nurses found out that she wasn't, they would go into her room and make fun of her, saying that she was actually 33, and that was what her file said, and just continually taunting her to the point where she would start screaming. And when it got to the point where the doctors could possibly hear what the nurses were doing, they would tell her to shut up, and they would begin to smack her head against things and choke her and drag her into the closet, and she came out with marks on her neck from where they did so. One patient, for crying, was beaten with a broomstick, and then her hands and feet were tied. She had a sheet wrapped around her head, twisted around her neck, and she was thrown in the cold water of the bathtub to drown. She survived though, and other times they would beat her head against the wall. They would pull out her hair from the root so it wouldn't grow back. She was also told of one patient who was sick and who had fought back their beatings, and they threw her in a cold tub and left her there, and then threw her on her bed, and the next morning she was found dead. And they did nothing about it. Nellie was keeping track of all of this almost in her head, and also in any papers and, pencils she could find to write it all down. And one thing she wrote about her time there was, "What a mysterious thing madness is. I have watched patients whose lips are forever sealed in perpetual silence. They live, breathe, eat. The body was missing." She said she began to have a smaller regard for the ability of doctors and a greater one for herself. And after 10 days, her editor came for her and released her from the human rat trap, as it was described as, easy to get in, impossible to get out. Except for her. And she was about to expose everything. They published her story and it spread quickly, but that's not all Nellie wanted to do. She actually took it to a court and demanded that Blackwell Island be investigated into immediately. And in fact, they took a jury there not too long after, but Blackwell Island had caught news of this and had cleaned up their act quickly. When they got there, all of the patients that Nellie had been with had disappeared. The nurses denied that those people even existed, but Nellie convinced the jury of what really happened, and so many of the cruel nurses had to be fired, the doctors had to be replaced, and the city of New York actually gave this institute $1 million to completely reform the entire operation. Nellie then wrote a book called 10 Days in the Madhouse, which went into detail about all of her findings while she was there. And by 1888, she was going on another investigative journey around the world in 80 days to see if she could do it. And she did it in 72. But then on January 27th, 1922, she died at the age of 57 of pneumonia. But I feel like she paved the way for so many investigative journalists and the mental institutes in general, the asylums, the way they worked, the way they were run. And I don't think that ever would have changed if it wasn't for her and her ability to go in and risk being tortured and completely broken down and going insane herself from pretending to be insane just to help these people inside. And I had to share her story because not only was it horrible what these victims went through, but also she deserves to be recognized so much more than she is. I'd never heard of her. So you'll have to let me know if you know if the patients that she was with in the asylum were ever found, because that's something I could not find. After she went back, they had just disappeared, and I'm not sure if she ever found them again. But do you think that you could have had the courage that she did? Because she had to go in there knowing that she was going to be harmed, and knowing she would probably have to sacrifice her own sanity to do this, and yet she did it anyway. But I hope you are liking Foul Play February. Remember, I am posting every single day, so there will be another video tomorrow, and thumbs up if you haven't already. And don't ever forget to speak up. Your voice is powerful enough, and I love you to absolute pieces. Okay, bye.